Hello and welcome to this episode of Happy Baking. This is the third and final episode of the
Biscuit Bonanza.
Yeah! In this episode, we're gonna build on the skills that we learned in parts 1 and 2 to make one of my most epic biscuit recipes ever, my flakiest cheese biscuits. This recipe comes from my book, Savory Baking, and it contains several formula adjustments to make some of my tallest, flakiest, most visibly layered biscuits ever. Yes, I'm talking about biscuits that may remind you of a certain kind that you see in American grocery store aisles. There's no way around it. These biscuits are amazing, and they are the perfect way to close out the biscuit bonanza. So let's get baking. Let's review some biscuit basics. Remember, keep things cold. Having cold ingredients and making sure that you have chill time throughout the recipe and before the biscuits are baked is crucial to the final texture of the biscuit. Specifically, when cold fat hits the heat of a hot oven, the moisture inside that fat evaporates, producing steam. This is what helps us get flaky layers. Try folding the dough. Rolling out and folding the dough, or adding physical lamination, encourages the fat, or the butter in this case, to form really thin, flat sheets throughout the baked good. In the case of this recipe, I'm actually going to be putting in even more folds than we did with the buttermilk biscuit. This physical layering before baking leads to glorious pull-apart layers after baking. Remember to not skimp on height. I tend to pat or roll out my dough a little bit thicker than some folks might think. But remember, a tall piece of dough before baking means a really tall biscuit after baking. So if you're looking for an impressive towering biscuit, keep it a little thicker. This biscuit recipe is definitely a little bit different than the others we've talked about so far in this bonanza. Yeah! So let's go over some of those differences step by step while we make the dough. First up, we're gonna mix the dry ingredients to combine. Now, this recipe has one notably different ingredient that has not appeared in the other biscuit recipes: yeast. This recipe is a bit of a mashup. It takes some notes from American-style buttermilk biscuits, but is also heavily inspired by Hungarian pogača. Pogača is a yeast-raised dough that undergoes a few rounds of folds or lamination to create super flaky layers. You're also gonna notice that there's two types of butter in this recipe. There's a smaller amount of cold cubed butter, and then a larger amount of room temperature butter. After I whisk the dry ingredients together, I'll add that cold cubed butter to the dry ingredients and mix it in as you would for a standard biscuit dough. We want to pretty much fully incorporate it, more like the way we did with our drop biscuit recipe. The rest of that softened butter is going to be added later. First, I'm going to mix the smaller amount of cold cubed butter into the dry ingredients. You can use your hands or a pastry cutter to do this, and the goal is to mix the butter almost entirely into the flour. It should resemble a course meal, which we already went over in the last episode. You should check it out. Once the butter is fully incorporated, make a well in the center of the mixture. The dairy ingredient used to bind these biscuits is sour cream. It makes the biscuits incredibly rich and gives them a beautiful, tangy flavor. I talked a little bit about using sour cream as a possibility in the very first episode of the bonanza. Yeah! And I'm gonna use it in these biscuits today. Mix the dough with your hands or a silicone spatula until it starts to come together. It'll look fairly shaggy at first, and as it gets a little bit firmer, you can knead it to continue to combine the ingredients. If after a little bit of kneading, the dough still looks dry, meaning it has visible floury pockets, add some water, about 15 grams or 1 tablespoon at a time, until it comes together. Turn out the dough onto your work surface and form it into a roughly rectangular shape. Then wrap the dough tightly in plastic wrap or beeswax wrap and refrigerate it to chill. You'll want to refrigerate it for at least 30 minutes and up to 2 hours. Let's talk about folding the dough. This dough gets a little bit more of an intense round of folding or lamination than I did with the buttermilk biscuits in episode 1 of the bonanza. When I add a single fold to my buttermilk biscuit recipe, I'm basically using it to help lighten the biscuits and give them a little extra height. In this recipe, I'm using several rounds of folds because I want to create really flaky biscuits with visible layers. It's even going to have a pull-apart effect. When you start to tear off the biscuits, you can peel them away layer by layer. After the initial chill, I'm gonna use the first fold to help me incorporate the rest of the butter in the recipe. That 8 ounces or 226 grams of room temperature butter. I'll roll out the dough on a lightly floured surface into a rectangle about 10 by 12 inches or 25 by 30 centimeters. Remember that amount, because that's what we're gonna keep coming back to every time we roll out the dough in this recipe. I'll use my hands to just sort of dot the butter all over the surface of the dough. You can even kind of smear it in with your fingertips to help get a pretty even all over layer of butter on the surface of the dough. Then I'll fold the dough in half, and I'll fold the halved dough in half again, AKA folding the dough into quarters. Then it's time to rewrap the dough and refrigerate it for 30 minutes before proceeding. This allows some of the fat in the dough to firm up, and it allows the gluten to relax before we roll it out again. I'll use the remaining 3 folds to help me incorporate the final ingredient in this recipe, the cheese. Adding the cheese this way ensures even layering of the cheese throughout. You kind of get these gooey, cheesy pockets in the center of the biscuit, and then you also get some on the outer cut edge of the biscuit that sort of turns brown and crispy. It's just awesome. So once again, on a lightly floured surface, I'll roll the dough into a rectangle 10 by 12 inches or 25 by 30 centimeters. I'll sprinkle about 1/3 of the shredded cheese over the dough. You can use cheddar, Gruyère, Gouda, really any kind of melty cheese that also gets a little bit crisp when it's baked. Then fold the dough in quarters once again. Wrap the dough tightly in plastic wrap or beeswax wrap and refrigerate it for at least 30 minutes before continuing. Now I basically need to do that process 2 more times. 2 more times of rolling it out, sprinkling on 1/3 of the remaining cheese, and folding it in quarters. You can sometimes get away with doing the last 2 folds back to back. So you just kind of have to see if your dough is resisting you at all when you're rolling it out. If it's difficult to roll out the dough, wrap it in plastic or beeswax wrap and put it back in the fridge. Give it that chill and rest time before continuing. When all of the cheese has been incorporated and you perform that final fold, the dough should be wrapped and rested for 1 hour before shaping. The dough has been nice and chilled, so let's talk about rolling out the dough and shaping these biscuits. This is the only time I'm gonna roll out the dough to a slightly different size, because this time I'm focusing more on the thickness of the dough. I want about 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters thick of dough before I cut biscuits. This means I'll roll the dough to approximately a 9 by 10 inch rectangle or a 23 to 25 centimeter rectangle. Because I'm making cutout biscuits, it doesn't really matter if you keep the dough perfectly rectangular in shape. So I know sometimes people get nervous that their dough is sort of oval or rounded. Remember, we're taking circles out of this, so we don't necessarily need it to have super straight edges. It can be a little wonky. Use a floured 3-inch or 8 centimeter cutter to cut your biscuits into rounds. If you don't have round cookie cutters, you can also find a similarly sized drinking glass where it has about a 3-inch or 8 centimeter wide rim. Look at these beautiful layers. You can see the pockets of cheese I was talking about throughout. You can also see visible layers already just in the dough. We're definitely gonna be able to see them after baking. Transfer the biscuits to parchment-lined baking sheets, slightly staggering them so that they can have even air circulation while they bake. You can press together any of the scraps of dough, gently knead them a couple of times, and re-roll them to get a few more biscuits. Finally, refrigerate the biscuits while you preheat the oven. Let's bake them! To bake your biscuits, preheat the oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit or 190 degrees Celsius with the oven racks in the upper and lower thirds of the oven. Egg wash the surface of the biscuits and bake them until they are deeply golden brown on the surface and you can see little browned pockets of the cheese throughout. It'll be about 30 to 34 minutes. Cool the biscuits for about 10 minutes if you want to serve them warm, or let them cool completely to room temperature. Some of these biscuits are a little less than perfect. They're no less delicious, but I just want to point out what I'm talking about. A couple of the biscuits kind of fell over, and I refuse to think that this is a bad thing because it just means that we created flakiness that could not be contained. It rose up and it just leaned over, and I'm okay with that. So I'm still gonna eat the heck out of those biscuits. They're especially good for kind of tearing open, putting some butter on them. And then you can also see this biscuit here on the end as an example of what they can look like when you've mashed the scraps together and re-rolled. It's still really tall, it's still flaky, just a little bit wonkier on the surface, whereas some of the perfect ones are a little bit flatter and more golden. So again, I don't view any of these biscuits as mistakes. I love them all equally, but just to point them out so that you know what's going on with those biscuits there. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Happy Baking, where I made my flakiest cheese biscuits. These biscuits are so good, from the crispy cheese bits around the base and outside to the glorious buttery flaky layers. I cannot wait to dive in. Remember, this recipe comes from my latest book, Savory Baking, and you can find more information about it, including where to buy it, at my website, erinjeannemcdowell.com. If this episode inspires you to bake, please let me know in the comments. I love to know what you're making in your kitchens. As always, the recipe is linked in the video description below. This was the perfect way to close out the
Biscuit Bonanza.
So until next time, wishing you lots of happy baking. They're so good.